Picture this. You're a nurse in Germany. It's the spring of 1940. Outside, the war is stretching across Europe, but inside this white-tiled hospital, it's quiet. Too quiet. You stand beside a crib in a small room that smells like antiseptic and boiled linen. You've worked here for months now, but every time you step into this room, your chest tightens. Here at the History Scar, we don't just look at the sanitized narratives. We peel them back to reveal the raw, uncomfortable truth. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. The baby is maybe 3 weeks old. Pale skin. A soft layer of dark hair. Eyes closed. A band of tape covers a tiny cleft in his upper lip. He has trouble feeding. You know his name, but you're not supposed to say it out loud. In fact, you've been told not to get too familiar at all. That's part of the training now. Distance, detachment, duty. In your left hand is a clipboard. On it, a checklist of symptoms. Heart murmur. Irregular breathing. Slow reflexes. In your right hand, a vial. You already know what's inside. You were told it's medication. But it doesn't cure anything. It stops things. Permanently. There's a stamp on the baby's file, Lebenswürts Leben. Life unworthy of life. That phrase alone has changed everything inside these walls. It started with adults, people with schizophrenia, epilepsy, intellectual disabilities. But now, it's children, babies. Some are born with club feet, some with Down syndrome. Some just cry too much or too little. Some are simply born to the wrong kind of parents. They tell you it's for the good of society, that these children would only suffer, that Germany must be purified. You're supposed to believe that. You try to believe it. But now, here in front of this crib, it's not theory. It's not policy. It's a child. A real one. He stirs slightly. Opens his mouth. A small gasp escapes his lips, but there's no cry. He's too tired. You notice the way his fingers curl, slowly, gently, then go still. Your breath catches in your throat. They trained you for this. Told you not to hesitate. A quiet end is kinder than a life of shame, one doctor had said with a straight face. He meant it. He was proud of his work. This hospital isn't advertised as a place of death. To the outside world, it's a care facility. But those who work inside know what it really is. A stopgap. A sorting house. A clean way to disappear the children who don't fit the ideal. The mother had cried when she handed him over. You remember. She begged for another test. Said he was just slow, not sick. But once the file was marked, her voice stopped mattering. You take a step closer. The sun hits the window just right, casting a pale glow across the baby's face. For a second, he looks peaceful. Like any child. Like every child. And that's the part that never stops hurting. You tilt the vial slightly. You remember the dosage by heart now. There's no ceremony. No prayer. Just quiet. The child doesn't resist. He never even opens his eyes again. When it's over, you check the time. Write down the note. Clean the vial. And move to the next room. This has become routine. Not for you emotionally, but for the system. In 1940, this was happening all across Germany. Dozens of facilities. Hundreds of staff. Thousands of children. Every day, decisions were made based not on health or possibility, but on ideology. What began as whispered orders became government policy. It was called Action T4. A code name, sterile and forgettable. But what it did was unforgettable. The children weren't named in reports. They were numbered. Their deaths were recorded as pneumonia or sudden illness. Their bodies were cremated. Ashes mailed to families, often with a sympathy letter typed by a secretary who never saw the child. Those who worked in the program were told they were advancing medicine, that they were serving the future. That compassion meant ending the life of a child who could never thrive in Hitler's Germany. But the truth was simpler and darker. These were executions, carried out in silence, sanctioned by science, justified by fear, hidden behind locked doors and stamped paperwork. And once you were part of it, there was no turning back. For every child like the one in that crib, there were hundreds more. Some didn't even make it into the hospitals. They were left at institutions and starved, or given high doses of morphine, or slowly sedated until their breathing stopped. Some were used for experiments first. None of them chose this. And yet, they were marked for death before they even opened their eyes. The phrase, life unworthy of life, didn't just kill these children. It erased them. From families, from history, from memory. The silent death of that child in the hospital crib wasn't a random act of cruelty. It wasn't just one doctor's choice or one nurse's weakness. It was part of a much bigger machine, designed, funded, and approved at the highest levels of Nazi Germany. This machine had a name, Action T4. It started with a letter. In October 1939, Adolf Hitler signed a secret decree backdated to September 1st, the day Germany invaded Poland. The timing was no accident. While the world watched tanks roll over borders, something darker was being set into motion at home. The decree was short and simple. It authorized doctors to grant what was called a mercy death to patients judged incurably sick. But the words were vague on purpose. They left room for interpretation. And in the wrong hands, interpretation meant death. The program got its nickname from its address. The office in charge of planning everything was based at Tiergartenstrasse 4, a quiet building in Berlin. T4. That's where the lists were made. That's where the orders were signed. That's where the deaths began. But Action T4 didn't come out of nowhere. The ground had been prepared for years. In the 1920s, long before Hitler came to power, German scientists and philosophers were already discussing eugenics, the belief that human beings could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce. It was considered modern, even progressive. The idea spread in academic circles, then to lawmakers, then to doctors. Some called it racial hygiene. The goal: to clean the German gene pool. Books were written. Charts were drawn. Public lectures were held. People with disabilities, mental illness, epilepsy, alcoholism, or even criminal records were labeled as degenerate stock. Their lives were seen not as equal, but as threats to society's health. By the time Hitler took control in 1933, the foundation had already been laid. All he had to do was take it to its most extreme conclusion. The Nazi Party fully embraced these ideas. They passed sterilization laws, forced women and men into operations they didn't consent to. People were examined, scored, and sorted like livestock. And the children. They were next. Under Action T4, the state created a system that looked medical on the outside but was deadly at its core. Doctors filled out forms. Nurses submitted reports. Government clerks sorted the data. Every child with a condition, real or imagined, was flagged for review. And then came the panels. 3 doctors. No physical exam. No meeting with the child. Just paperwork. Each file had a form, a brief description, and a photo. The doctors checked boxes. 1 red plus mark meant life. 2 meant death. If they disagreed, a 4th doctor was brought in. The whole process could take minutes. These weren't courtroom trials. They weren't even medical reviews. They were rubber stamps. And once a child was marked, there was almost no way out. Leading the charge was Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician. He oversaw the program with cold efficiency. To him, and many like him, these killings weren't crimes. They were solutions. He believed removing burdens from society was a moral duty. Brandt and his team turned regular hospitals into elimination centers. Facilities like Hadamar, Grafeneck, Brandenburg, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, and Hartheim were quietly converted. Some were old asylums. Some were care homes. All of them were equipped with gas chambers, cremation ovens, and medical wings that doubled as death floors. But to the outside world, nothing changed. There were no signs, no announcements. Parents were told their children were being transferred for better care. The words used were carefully chosen: relocation, special treatment, therapy, euthanasia, mercy death. But what happened behind closed doors was neither merciful nor medical. Children were sedated and poisoned. Some were starved. Others were taken to gas chambers. The methods changed depending on the site, but the result was always the same. And when the children died, families received polite letters. The death was blamed on pneumonia, seizures, or infection. Sometimes a fake urn was sent. No one was allowed to ask questions. The killings became so routine that some doctors referred to them as discharges. In their paperwork, they used symbols instead of names. The victims were reduced to numbers, diagnoses, and abbreviations. But none of it would have worked without the lies. The Nazi regime was careful. They knew these actions, if fully known, might cause unrest. So they worked in shadows. They controlled the press. They used vague language. They framed everything as a benefit to society. And they leaned heavily on fear. Fear of defectiveness, fear of weakness, fear of being left behind. This wasn't just a military dictatorship. It was a culture of control. Families were scared to ask too many questions. Neighbors were afraid to speak up. And doctors, who should have been the first line of defense, became executioners in lab coats. By 1941, over 5,000 children had been killed through Action T4's pediatric branch. And the program was still expanding. The plan was never just to remove the sick. It was to engineer a perfect society. One where only the strong had value. Where anything less than ideal was quietly erased. And if you think this was limited to Germany, it wasn't. Medical journals from other countries followed the program. Some praised it. Others stayed silent. The language of burden and defect was spoken in many places, not just Berlin. Action T4 didn't end because the Nazis changed their minds. It slowed down only when public rumors grew too loud to ignore. Even then, it didn't stop, it just went deeper underground. And the people who built it, most weren't punished. Some went back to their hospitals. Others moved into post-war clinics. A few even helped design modern institutions. This is how genocide begins. Not with bombs or armies, but with charts, files, and quiet decisions. With professionals who trade compassion for compliance. And with a society willing to look the other way. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. That's the point. Because what happened next only gets worse. What sealed a child's fate under Action T4 wasn't always visible. Some had physical differences, club feet, cleft lips, malformed limbs. Others looked perfectly healthy. But in the eyes of Nazi doctors, appearance didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was how well a child fit the regime's definition of useful. The criteria were disturbingly broad. Children with Down syndrome were marked almost immediately. So were those with autism, epilepsy, or cerebral palsy. If a child had seizures, delayed speech, or poor coordination, it was seen as a warning sign. But it didn't stop at medical conditions. Behavior was also judged. If a child was too quiet, too energetic, too emotional, or simply slow to learn, they could be flagged as defective. One report listed a boy for elimination because he refused to obey. Another was marked because she did not make eye contact. Some children were selected just because they were born to unmarried mothers or came from families that already had other children in care. And then there were the children considered impure for reasons that had nothing to do with health. Romani children. Children of Jewish descent. Children born from relationships between Germans and foreigners. Even if they were physically strong and developmentally normal, they were labeled as racial threats. A single grandparent who was Jewish could be enough. So could speaking the wrong dialect or having a non-German last name. In many cases, race and disability were treated as the same type of defect. It's important to understand how cold the system was. Doctors didn't make these decisions after seeing a child in person. Most of the time, they never met the children at all. Instead, they relied on forms, standardized questionnaires sent to institutions, schools, orphanages, and hospitals. Nurses, teachers, and even caretakers were asked to fill them out. Often, parents never knew these reports were being written. The forms had no space for stories. No room for context. Just boxes to tick. Fails to speak by age 3. Shows no emotional response. Sibling already in institution. Born to non-Aryan parent. Each checkbox increased the child's risk. Once completed, these forms were mailed to the central office. There, a group of Nazi-appointed doctors sorted them into categories. Tier 1, considered educable, might live under strict care. Tier 2, questionable, to be re-evaluated. Tier 3, incurable or unfit, recommended for elimination. No appeals. No second opinions. No family meetings. Just a decision made by strangers, based on a piece of paper. The worst part? Many of these reports were written by people who genuinely believed they were helping. Some thought they were making space for healthier children. Others were afraid to say no. A few may have wanted to protect their jobs. But whatever their reason, they became part of the killing process. And the deception didn't end there. Once a child was marked for death, the parents weren't told the truth. They received a letter, polite, formal, distant. It usually said the child had taken ill or passed away unexpectedly. The cause of death was nearly always pneumonia, a disease easy to fake and harder to question. One mother kept every letter the clinic sent her. Her daughter had been in care for developmental delays. The girl was 5, cheerful, curious, always humming. One day, without warning, the letters changed tone. Her child had fallen suddenly ill. Then came a death certificate. A few weeks later, a small box of ashes arrived by post. But something was off. The dates didn't add up. The timeline felt wrong. When she asked for more information, the hospital stopped replying. She never got the truth. In another case, a father traveled to the facility after receiving news of his son's death. He demanded to see the grave. Staff refused. When he insisted, they called the police. He left without answers. There are hundreds of stories like these. Families lied to, misled, or completely shut out. Some only learned the truth decades later, when records were unsealed or mass graves were uncovered. One child was institutionalized at age 3 for a speech delay. By 6, he was marked as unfit. His form included the phrase, lacks enthusiasm for group tasks. That was enough. He never saw his 7th birthday. This wasn't medicine. It wasn't therapy. It was systematic removal, an assembly line of judgment, carried out in silence. The language was cold. The logic was twisted. And the damage was permanent. Many people think the Holocaust began with concentration camps and firing squads. But it started earlier. It started with ideas about perfection. It started with ranking people by worth. It started with children. Children deemed too slow, too different, or born into the wrong background. Action T4 showed the world how easily a society can turn bureaucracy into murder. All it takes is a few checked boxes, a quiet room, and a system that no longer sees the human being behind the file. If you're feeling horrified right now, remember this: those who forget history are doomed to watch it repeat. Don't let this vanish. Subscribe to the History Scar. Once a child was selected for elimination, the rest of the process moved quickly and quietly. It often started with a letter or a phone call. Parents were told that their child was being moved to a special care facility. The reason sounded hopeful. The facility had better doctors, newer equipment, more advanced therapies. Some families were even told their child had been accepted into a pilot program or a new research project. None of it was true. The child would be picked up in a van, sometimes painted white with a Red Cross symbol, to look like a medical transport. The sight of those vans became common in cities across Germany and Austria. Most people didn't ask questions. A few began to recognize what the vans really meant. They whispered. They looked away. Inside the van, there was no comfort, no family, just staff and silence. Children were sometimes strapped into seats or laid on stretchers. If they cried or asked questions, they were ignored. Many were already sedated. The ride could take hours, depending on where they were being sent. There were 6 main centers in the T4 program: Hadamar, Hartheim, Greifswald, Brandenburg, Bernburg, and Sonnenstein. Each one was located away from major cities. Each one looked, from the outside, like a quiet hospital or home. And each one had a carefully organized process for ending lives. Let's walk through what happened at Hadamar. When the van arrived, the staff greeted it without emotion. The children were unloaded and brought inside through side entrances to avoid attention. Some were taken to holding rooms, where they waited, often sedated or strapped into beds. Others were moved directly to the so-called treatment areas. One of the most horrifying features was the gas chamber, disguised as a shower room. It had tiled walls, metal pipes, a large drainage system on the floor. There were even bars of soap placed on benches to maintain the illusion. The children were told they were going to be bathed. Some were undressed by nurses. Others were led in groups, still in their hospital gowns. The door closed behind them. Carbon monoxide gas was released through hidden valves. It usually took minutes. On some days, dozens of children died this way. The chambers were cleaned between each use. Nurses recorded names. Doctors signed off the files. The staff was trained not to show emotion. Once the child was dead, the body was removed and taken to the cremation ovens, which ran day and night. Ashes were collected in bulk and later divided into containers that were labeled and sent to families. Most of those families never knew they were receiving the remains of multiple children mixed together. Some received letters of condolence, typed neatly on official stationery. One mother kept the letter she received. It said her son had died peacefully in his sleep from a respiratory infection. It included a line thanking her for her trust in the institution's care. She had no idea her son had been poisoned in a gas chamber within hours of arriving. And yet, even in these places, the illusion of care was kept alive. Staff wore white coats. Charts were maintained. Meals were recorded, even if they were never served. In some rooms, clocks hung on the walls. But they didn't have hands. They never ticked. They never moved. These weren't clocks. They were symbols. To the people working there, time didn't matter for the children brought in. Their lives were already over the moment they arrived. The clocks served as a reminder. Here, the future stops. Post-war investigations uncovered what really happened inside these clinics. One staff member from Hartheim admitted under questioning that they processed around 30 to 40 children per week. When asked how he coped with the job, he said, "You get used to it." At Brandenburg, a former nurse confessed to preparing the children for the gas chamber, describing how some were quiet while others begged for their mothers. One girl, age 6, asked if her mother would be joining her. She died minutes later. Testimonies like these painted a clear picture. The system was smooth, professional, and utterly inhumane. To keep the truth hidden, the Nazi regime monitored families closely. If a parent raised too many questions, they were threatened. Some were accused of being disloyal to the Reich. Others were told that speaking out could endanger their remaining children. In this way, silence was maintained through fear. In rare cases, families discovered the truth. One father, a World War I veteran, managed to track down the facility where his daughter had been taken. When he demanded to see the death certificate, it had the wrong date and misspelled her name. He never received an explanation. Another parent noticed that the ashes mailed to her were not consistent with the weight of a child's remains. She wrote multiple letters but never received a reply. The disposal system was efficient. Ovens ran constantly, and any remains that weren't mailed out were dumped in nearby fields or buried in mass graves behind the facilities. Years later, excavations would uncover hundreds of bone fragments, teeth, and pieces of clothing. The goal wasn't just death. It was erasure. To kill the child and erase the memory. And yet, the system left behind traces. Clocks with no hands. Death certificates with matching diagnoses. Identical condolence letters sent to dozens of families. Little signs that something terrible had happened, repeated over and over again. This wasn't about mercy. It wasn't about medicine. It was about building a perfect society by removing anyone who didn't fit. And the children, some just toddlers, others barely born, were the first to be sacrificed. This is what a medical genocide looks like. Not loud, not chaotic, but organized, documented, and carried out by people in white coats who stopped seeing human beings and started seeing numbers. If you made it this far and your heart is heavy, it should be. This history is not distant. It's not fiction. It's real. It happened behind closed doors, while the world looked away. By now, you've heard the policies, the clinics, the systems. But none of it truly hits until you look at the lives that were taken. Not as statistics, not as cases, but as children. They had names. They had families. Some had dreams, or at least the beginning of one. These are 3 of them. We don't have all the details. The records are often incomplete or deliberately vague. But what we do have is enough. Enough to feel the silence they left behind. The baby with the clubfoot. Munich, 1941. He was born in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of the city. His birth certificate is still in the archive, dated March 12, 1941. His mother was 22. His father worked for the railways. There's no photo of him in the file, but the medical report describes him as having a strong heartbeat, clear lungs, and alert eyes. The only note of concern was the right foot, curved inward at the ankle. What we'd call a clubfoot today. A condition that's treatable. But in Nazi Germany, it was seen as a flaw. A sign of weakness. The family resisted the suggestion to place him in a state institution. A doctor had written a recommendation for transfer to a pediatric clinic known for corrective care, but his parents knew better. They'd heard the stories. For 6 months, they kept him at home. Appointments were missed. Letters from the clinic went unanswered. Then one night, a nurse arrived at their apartment with 2 men in uniform. She told the parents the state was intervening for the child's health. She used the phrase, government concern. The baby was taken. He ended up at a facility outside Munich. His file shows he was examined, sedated, and marked for T4 action. He died 4 days later. Decades later, a historian reviewing archived letters found a small, folded note hidden inside a government folder, misfiled or perhaps placed there on purpose. It was written in pencil, by the baby's mother. The handwriting was shaky. The paper was stained. It read, "I love you, little soldier. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." That's all. No name. No date. Just the voice of a mother talking to her child one last time. The 9-year-old Romani girl with a stutter. Austria, 1942. She was part of a traveling Romani family that had settled in the outskirts of Vienna. Her name is redacted in the records, but we know she was 9. She had a stutter, nothing severe, but enough to be noticed in school. When Nazi racial laws expanded, Romani families were rounded up. They were labeled as asocial and genetically inferior. Her family was arrested and split apart. She was separated from her siblings and sent to Spiegelgrund, a children's facility in Vienna that became one of the most notorious sites of Nazi child euthanasia. The building still stands today. Her intake form listed her as speech delayed, emotionally unstable, potentially feeble-minded. All of it was based on a 15-minute observation. The staff noted she had trouble with authority and difficulty making eye contact. Those notes were enough to classify her as defective. She spent her last weeks in Ward 15, one of the clinic's lower floors, where many children were kept before treatment. Former nurses would later testify that this was where children were sedated with luminol, a barbiturate that slowed the heart and eventually caused death. What makes her story different is that something from her time there survived. In her file, stuffed between medical notes, was a crayon drawing. It had been folded several times and had no label, but it was hers. The drawing shows a small house with a red roof. A sun in the corner. A dog with big ears. There's a figure in the middle. Stick arms, 2 bright blue circles for eyes. One psychologist who studied it said it was the kind of picture a child makes when they're homesick. A memory of somewhere they felt safe. She never saw that home again. Her death was listed as complications due to infection. No infection was ever recorded. Today, that drawing is preserved in a museum. A silent testimony from a child who couldn't finish her sentence, but knew how to draw what she missed. The boy who memorized Beethoven. Berlin, 1943. His name was Johannes. He was 11. He had Asperger's syndrome, though it wasn't called that then. His school records say he had trouble with group work but excelled in music. By age 10, he could play full Beethoven sonatas from memory. He didn't like loud noises. He avoided eye contact. But when he played piano, he didn't want to stop. His teacher once said, "The boy speaks best through music." In 1943, the school where he studied was contacted by a local health office. Inspectors had been ordered to report any students with social difficulties or neurological concerns. Johannes was flagged. The principal, trying to protect him, wrote a letter recommending that the boy continue musical training. It was ignored. He was taken from his family under the claim that he was being moved to a specialized conservatory. His parents never saw him again. He was sent to A.M. Spiegelgrund, the same institution where the Romani girl died. A nurse's statement from years later recalls him clearly. He didn't speak much, but he hummed. All the time. Mostly classical pieces. One day, he sat in the hallway, humming Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata before his injection. He didn't cry. He just kept humming until he fell asleep. His body was buried in a mass grave behind the clinic. No marker. No music. Decades later, when remains were being exhumed for proper burial, they found a small object buried with the others, a tiny metal treble clef on a broken chain. No way to prove it was his. But someone had placed it there. Each of these children was erased by a system that saw them as problems to be solved. Their differences weren't threats. They were human. But in a world built on purity and control, even a stutter or a curved foot was enough to warrant death. They didn't die because they were sick. They died because others decided their lives didn't matter. If these children could speak today, what would they ask of you? For every child taken into the T4 program, there were people who knew. A neighbor who saw the van pull up. A nurse who filled out the form. A teacher who marked a child as slow to learn. A clerk who typed the death certificate. The system could not have worked without thousands of small acts. Some were active. Some were passive. Most were quiet. This chapter isn't about the men in uniform or the people writing policy. It's about ordinary citizens, the ones who lived next door to the clinics, the ones who said nothing, the ones who helped, and the few who risked everything to fight back. In small towns near Hadamar or Hartheim, residents began to notice the smoke. The smell. They saw the buses arrive with children and leave empty. They heard the rumors. Some whispered about what was happening inside. But most said nothing. Some didn't want to know. Others were afraid to ask. A few believed it was necessary. A woman who worked at a bakery near Hadamar later said, "We knew something wasn't right. The staff bought extra bread, but no one ever came to pick it up. And the air, it always smelled like burning." When asked why she didn't report it, she shrugged. Report it to who? Inside the clinics, medical professionals followed orders. Many had taken an oath to heal, but that didn't stop them from injecting poison, approving transfers, or falsifying diagnoses. Some were true believers in eugenics. Others told themselves they had no choice. One doctor wrote, "These children would have grown up to be burdens. We spared them that fate." Some nurses disagreed, but stayed silent. One young nurse who later testified at a post-war trial said she would cry after her shifts, but never refused an order. "If I had said no," she said, "someone else would have done it. At least I tried to be gentle." The truth is, The silence was a choice. The silence of churches was one of the most painful parts of this story. The Nazis' new religion held power in Germany and Austria. At first, they tried to keep T4 hidden. But by 1940, the truth had begun to leak. Some members of the clergy started asking questions. One Catholic bishop, Clemens August von Galen, stood out. In 1941, he gave a sermon condemning the killing of innocent people, especially the disabled. He didn't name the program directly, but everyone knew what he meant. His words were copied and spread secretly. For a moment, the regime paused. Some gas chambers were shut down, but the killings continued in other forms. Most churches, however, said little. Some feared being shut down. Others agreed with the ideas behind the program. In Nazi ideology, strength was sacred. Weakness was shameful. Too many religious leaders chose self-preservation over truth. Still, there were exceptions, individuals who acted when institutions failed. A small group of priests and nuns began to perform secret baptisms for disabled children, hoping a Christian name and certificate would spare them. Some tried to hide children in monasteries. A few doctors forged paperwork to make a child appear healthier than they were. Some families paid bribes, moved cities, or faked illnesses to keep their children off official lists. One mother in Hamburg pretended her son had died, staging a funeral with an empty casket. She hid him in an attic for 2 years. He survived the war and later spoke about the quiet, endless fear of being discovered. But for every act of protection, there was also betrayal. Some families gave up their children willingly, believing it was better to do what the state advised. Some believed the lies about treatment. Others believed in the ideology itself. A father in Leipzig reported his own daughter, who had learning difficulties. He called her unfit to carry on the family name. She was taken 2 weeks later. His wife never forgave him. Even among siblings, choices had to be made. A brother who hid his disabled sister. A cousin who turned in a relative for speaking against the program. The war fractured families, not just through bombs and death, but through loyalty to a system that demanded silence. The Nazi regime didn't just rely on guns. It relied on fear. And fear was the strongest tool they had. People feared for their jobs, their reputations, their families. They feared being labeled unpatriotic or enemy sympathizers. Many convinced themselves they didn't know enough to act, that they weren't involved, that looking away was safer. And that's how it worked. The machinery of death didn't need everyone to agree. It just needed enough people to stay quiet. Enough people to file the paperwork, drive the buses, fill the prescriptions, or turn the key in the door. Evil doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like indifference. But some, a brave few, refused to be part of it. Doctors who signed fake reports. Nurses who smuggled out messages. Church workers who created underground sanctuaries for the children the Reich wanted to erase. These people didn't stop the system. But they saved lives. And they proved that conscience still existed, even in the darkest rooms. Their stories are a reminder. You always have a choice. You can follow orders. You can look away. Or you can stand up, even when it costs everything. What would you have done? That question isn't just for the past. It's for right now. Because silence is still dangerous. Systems still decide who matters and who doesn't. People are still judged by what they can produce, how they look, or how well they fit. So ask yourself honestly, if it was your neighbor, your student, your own child, what would you do? And if you're watching this, still wondering if these stories matter, remember, every child lost in T4 died not just from poison, but from a world that let it happen. By 1945, Nazi Germany was falling apart. Cities were burning. Soldiers were surrendering. And the world was finally seeing what had been hidden for so long. When Allied troops entered the heart of Germany and Austria, they expected to find battlefields. What they didn't expect were clinics filled with silence and ash. At Hadamar, American soldiers opened the doors and walked into what looked like an ordinary mental institution. But the basement told another story. Cremation ovens still warm. Ash piles too large to explain. Death books filled with names, times, and signatures, one every few minutes. The soldiers weren't prepared for what they found. No one was. In their reports, they described walls stained with smoke, boxes of children's clothing, and jars of preserved organs, labeled by diagnosis. One sergeant wrote, "This wasn't war. This was something colder." Photographs were taken. Testimonies recorded. Witnesses questioned. But the scale of it all was hard to believe. The idea that doctors, trained to heal, had designed an assembly line of death was something the world had never seen before. The discoveries led directly to the Nuremberg medical trials, a separate set of hearings held after the main war crimes tribunal. The goal was to bring to justice the physicians and administrators behind the so-called euthanasia program. In court, the details came out. One doctor admitted to overseeing more than 10,000 deaths. Another claimed he was only following instructions. Some denied everything. Others tried to justify it, saying they were preventing future suffering. The word mercy kept coming up. But the children weren't on trial. They couldn't speak. Only their files, their photos, and their remains told the truth. And even then, justice was uneven. Only a handful of T4 officials were tried. Some received prison sentences. A few were hanged. But many others were never charged at all. Some fled. Others blended back into society. A surprising number went back to work, at hospitals, clinics, universities. In West Germany, during the 1950s and 60s, it was considered politically sensitive to talk too much about T4. Families who had lost children were often told to keep quiet. Those who tried to speak out were accused of digging up the past, of stirring up shame. In Austria, the silence was even deeper. Facilities like AM Spiegelgrund operated in plain view, and yet the full story didn't reach the public until decades later. A 1960s newspaper article described one clinic as having had controversial wartime practices. That was it. No names. No mention of children. No graves. There were efforts to sanitize the narrative. Some doctors were quietly praised for their scientific contributions. Institutions rebranded. Records disappeared. Walls were repainted. And slowly, a new story took shape, that T4 was a small, tragic mistake made by a few bad men. But the truth was always bigger than that. The documents still existed. So did the bones. Mass graves were discovered behind clinics. Ovens were found with human ash packed into their walls. Testimonies surfaced from nurses, janitors, even local children who had seen too much. Historians began to piece it together. Piece by piece, the picture became clear again. Still, accountability lagged. Some of the worst perpetrators lived out full lives. One senior physician who helped design the T4 forms died comfortably in the 1980s. Another led a hospital for decades. A third worked on government health policy into the 1970s. They changed names, kept their heads down, and were protected by a system that wanted to move on. It wasn't until the 1990s that Real memorials started to appear. A plaque here. A museum room there. Names etched into stone. Children once erased from memory were now being written back into it. In Vienna, the grounds of AM Spiegelgrund were turned into a memorial. But it took years. 4 decades, bones remained in storage, unburied. Some families only found out what happened to their children after filing court requests. Others never found out at all. Germany eventually acknowledged T4 publicly. The federal government apologized. School curriculums began to include it. But for many, it was too little, too late. There is still no single monument that holds all the names of the children lost to T4. No full list. No national day of mourning. Just fragments. That's how cover-ups work. They don't always erase everything. They just leave gaps, empty spaces where stories should be. And over time, those gaps become silence. That's why remembering matters. Because even now, decades later, some people still hesitate to believe this happened. Some downplay it. Others ignore it altogether. But the evidence is there. The bones were found. The files were real. The children are gone. The Nazi child euthanasia program ended with the fall of the regime. The clinics were shut down. The files locked away. The staff scattered. But the ideas, the beliefs that fueled it, those never disappeared. They just changed their language. Today, the word eugenics makes people uncomfortable. It should. But that hasn't stopped modern societies from embracing a different version of the same question. What lives are worth living? It begins earlier now. With prenatal screening, expecting parents are offered detailed tests. These tests can identify conditions like Down syndrome, spina bifida, and other genetic differences before a child is born. And in many cases, once a diagnosis is confirmed, the pressure begins. The advice comes softly. It's your choice, of course, but you should think about quality of life for the child and for you. In some countries, over 90% of babies diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. That statistic isn't the result of medical necessity. It's cultural. There is no law forcing it. No government order. Just a quiet message. This life may not be worth your effort. And that message echoes loudly through the way modern systems treat disabled and neurodivergent children. In schools, these children are often labeled as disruptive, uncooperative, or low-functioning. In hospitals, they face longer waits and fewer treatment options. Insurance companies question their worth through cost-benefit formulas. Education programs sort them by potential. It's not that people want to be cruel. But cruelty doesn't always look like malice. Sometimes it looks like neglect, like low expectations, like ignoring a child because they don't fit the mold. We live in a world obsessed with productivity and perfection. Every app, every test, every system is designed to reward speed, efficiency, appearance, and performance. We admire success, strength, intelligence, on narrow terms. And anyone who falls outside those terms is left out of the story. But history warns us what happens when a society decides that value must be earned. The Nazi doctors didn't start by killing children. They started by creating categories, by deciding who belonged and who didn't. They created paperwork, processes, language. They gave death a new name, mercy, relief. We hear echoes of that today. When a child is denied basic accommodations in school because there's not enough funding. When a healthcare system chooses not to treat a disabled person because the cost outweighs the expected outcome. When society defines people by how well they produce, rather than who they are. This isn't ancient history. It's current policy. Quiet patterns. Dismissed complaints. Budget cuts. Avoided conversations. And it always begins the same way. By dehumanizing those who need the most care. But the opposite is also true. We can remember. We can resist. And we can rebuild the definition of worth, not based on output, but on humanity itself. Picture this. A nurse stands in a modern hospital NICU. She's holding a newborn child with Down syndrome. Tubes are taped to the baby's arm. The heart monitor beeps softly beside them. The nurse has seen the statistics. She knows the weight of history. But she looks down at the baby and whispers, "You are wanted. You are enough." She remembers. She remembers what happens when society forgets. And so should we. Because history doesn't just scar, it speaks. And here at the History Scar, we're not afraid to listen. These stories don't survive unless we carry them forward. So if this video made you think, like it. If it made you feel something, share it. If you believe these stories matter, leave a comment. Tell us how you'll remember them. And above all, subscribe now. Help make silence impossible. Let the past be heard. Let the lost be seen. Let no child be erased again.